I'm Gareth Jones. I've been writing and broadcasting about boxing in Wales mainly, but also elsewhere, for more than half a century, which is fairly frightening when you think about it. I've also just completed a 7-volume series called The Boxers of Wales, which profiles boxers of reasonable standing throughout the country and throughout the history of the sport.
And what would you say your experience of women's boxing has been in Wales?
Patchy and very recent, because until, of course, the famous case where Jane Couch took the Boxing Board of Control to court, there was no official women's boxing in Wales. There wasn't even much of an unofficial scene, as far as I could understand. And the amateur boxing, allowing women to box, came later than the professionals. So it's been fairly recent, but it's been fairly positive.
And are there any specific female boxers that you think, I know you've profiled some in your book, can you tell us a little bit about those?
Well, the best boxers, female boxers from Wales have clearly been, in the case of the amateurs, Lauren Price, obviously winning the Olympic gold, following world gold, European gold and Commonwealth gold. That's a pretty exceptional record for anyone to have. And we all now wait to see what she is going to do in the professional ring when she finally makes up her mind which manager and promotional arm she's going with. As a professional, we've only had 2 licensed professional boxers, and Lana Cooper, bless her, with constantly dislocating shoulders, only managed 10 fights in 11 years and lost them all. It was great to see this year that she's reverted to the amateurs at 35 and actually won the Welsh amateur title this year, and hopefully might get her to the Commonwealth Games later this summer. But the successful boxer on the Welsh professional scene has been Ashley Brace, who went all the way to 2 European title fights. The first she drew, the second she won, but unfortunately decided that she'd had enough for a multitude of reasons. I don't think she felt she was being paid enough, although it's a pretty thankless job if you're not Katie Taylor and presumably Lauren Price, for a promoter to actually pay you big bucks. And she drifted from the scene and went back to her first love, which is kickboxing and training Team Storm up in Evervale. But whether we'll ever see Ashley in a competitive ring again remains to be seen.
Have you seen much female participation in boxing generally in Wales over the years, or has it been, from your experience, a very male-dominated environment?
It's been a pretty male-dominated environment. There was one period where, in the 70s into the 80s, the British Boxing Board of Control were faced with a problem. They had a basic conflict of interest. Most promoters are also managers. Maybe not directly in some of the big people like the Hearns and the Warrens, but certainly at local level. And the only purpose of a manager risking his money on a promotion is to give his fighters work in the home corner rather than travelling to somebody else's backyard each time. So invariably a local hall bill would involve 6 or 7 fighters from the promoter's stable. Now, given basically the promoter is out to make a profit, the manager is out to get the best deal for his boxer. When those 2 are the same person, it's a pretty obvious conflict of interest. This was taken up. There were threats of court action by boxers who said that they'd been failed and they'd lost money because their manager was also their promoter. The board decided, in its wisdom at the time, that they would bring in a new rule where only 3 members of the promoter's stable could feature on the shows. Now, of course, this would just have meant that the shows weren't worthwhile. The promoters putting them on. I mean, it was a self-defeating move. But for a while at least, many promoters got around that by having their wife or daughter, in the case of Catherine Morrison up in Glasgow, taking over the promotional license. Whether they did any promotional work, it varied from person to person. But in Wales we had two examples of that. Teresa Breen, the wife of Colin Breen, the Swansea-based promoter, was already very much involved. I mean, the gym was at the back of their house, and she was involved with many of the boxers, knew them all, and knew the ropes of the business. And so Teresa actually did the work that the promoter normally does. The other example was a fellow called Jack Evans, who was a promoter in Pontypool, whose wife Marion was supportive but wasn't involved in putting on the shows. But in fact, the late great Johnny Owen made his pro debut in the old Pontypool Leisure Centre on a show that technically was promoted by Marion Evans, although Marion did nothing more than sit at ringside. So that was a way that some women first became involved. There were then a couple of women who became seconds, notably a Londoner called Tanya Follett, who also later became a manager, and a girl from West Wales who took out a license but actually only worked for 2 shows, if that. And there was also another one, a physio from West Wales, who's daughter of a very good trainer called Jimmy Bromfield. Joanne was the physio to the Welsh amateur squad for a while, indeed for the Irish amateur squad as well. But it was fairly peripheral. Then fairly recently, and certainly after women started boxing, the Welsh Area Council of the British Boxing Board of Control employed, or not employed because it's a voluntary role, but took on board Charlotte Davis, a solicitor, to become one of their number. And when Charlotte left, she was replaced by Gemma Price, who's also involved with Llanroni Phoenix Amateur Club, and is very much more involved on a day-to-day basis than Charlotte was. So there've been women involved from time to time. Otherwise, prior to that, it was round card girls, and that was it.
And what's your first memory of writing about women's boxing in Wales?
It would have been when Ashley Brace turned pro, because well, actually I wrote a feature for Big Issue about Lana Cooper when she was about to turn pro as the first, and Wales This Week, the ITV Wales programme, commissioned me to do a feature on her. So she got quite a lot of publicity before she turned pro, but she never actually boxed in Wales as a pro. She was always the opponent in somebody else's corner, which may well have contributed to 1 or 2 of the defeats. But so Ashley Brace was the first woman to box on a pro show in Wales, and in fact boxed, I think, every one of her pro fights in Wales. So I covered all of those, and yeah, she was good. She was good. She won all bar the one that she drew, and yes, she was a talent and worth the effort. There's always an extra effort, as her promoter Chris Senegal pointed out. If you have a talented woman boxer, the pool certainly 10 years ago was so small that the chances of finding another British fighter of her weight division was minimal, especially if you wanted to, shall we say, guarantee her a win. You wouldn't want to be fighting someone who was pretty good, otherwise you end up with your star fighter losing, possibly being disillusioned and quitting, and that's there's no future in that for a promoter. So every opponent that Ashley Brace fought had to be brought in from the continent, along with a trainer, possibly two, hotel bills, airfares, and it's not easy to promote women boxers at a fairly modest level without the sort of Olympian fanfare behind them. This is one of the problems that Senegal, in fairness, did put Ashley Brace on top of the bill, first Welsh woman to top a bill in Wales, well, still the first one, in Ebbw Vale, and it was less than half full. I mean, even in her hometown, there were not that many people came to watch her. And even when she was fighting for the European titles, the majority of the crowd were there watching the men on the bill. So there was never very much money for Ashley when you allow for the expense of getting the opponents in from various parts of Eastern Europe or France and Spain and Romania, where her two title opponents came from. One of the reasons that she drifted away from the sport was dissatisfaction with the money, but I think that there wasn't much chance of her getting any more in those days.
Do you think that was the biggest limitation with female boxers, with the sport growing? Do you think it's financial, or would you say there's also an element of conservatism around female identity in the public eye?
I think there may have been to start with. I think that the big thing that made a change in attitudes to female boxing, not just in Wales but worldwide, was when it was accepted as an Olympic sport. And particularly in Britain, of course, with the Olympics it first appeared in was 2012 in London. Nicola Adams winning the first gold medal, British. Katie Taylor with a phenomenal following from Ireland winning as well. And Clarissa Shields taking the third, only 3 weights, but the standard was high. What the Olympics to aim for, amateur boxing began to attract more and more women, so that the women who came into the sport were learning the basics. I mean, I can't forget the time I saw Laila Ali fight in Los Angeles, and she was up against this 42-year-old former streetwalker who basically didn't really know how to hold her hands up, let alone box. And she won in about 1 or 2 rounds. Well, I mean, that does nothing for the credibility of the sport at all. Bringing it into the amateurs meant that they were getting the proper training, the same training. There were amateur clubs who would say, well, we've only got 1 toilet or whatever it was, and refuse them. But I don't think there are too many that do now. Most amateur clubs in Wales would have girls boxing there, training there. But that was the problem then. Since they've been learning, people who are coming into the pro ranks have got a background. They're not just people who used to have fights outside pubs or something. They are people who are trained boxers, and the standard has massively improved as a result. And the spectacle has massively improved as a result.
And what do you see of the future of women's boxing in Wales?
The future of women's boxing in Wales at the moment is Lauren Price. Now, it depends on who she goes with. It depends on how often she fights in Wales, but even if she doesn't, there's no reason at all why she wouldn't have high prominence in the media in Wales, and indeed attract fans to travel to watch her in London or Manchester, Liverpool, wherever she ended up fighting. There is still a fairly shallow pool of talent at the top, which is why women can win world titles with half a dozen fights behind them if they've got the amateur pedigree as well. They've already beaten better people in the amateurs, and they're likely to meet in the first couple of fights in the pros. So when Lauren turns pro, and it's a matter I haven't spoken to her recently, but it seems to be a matter of any day there will be an announcement. The expectation is that she would win at least one world title belt within the first 3 or 4 fights. Women's boxing, of course, has the same problem as men's in that there are 4 major sanctioning bodies, therefore 4 world title belts, as it were, plus others that are even more fringe. And the difficulty with that is that when you take one champion out of the equation, and maybe someone who's a mandatory challenger to that champion, the ones that are left for the other people to defend against are not necessarily very good. And so you can get people winning world titles without actually beating anybody particularly special, defending it without beating anybody particularly special. And you end up with the only major fights available are the ones that tend to cross weights. We're now beginning to get to see them, potentially Clarissa Fields and Savannah Marshall in Britain in the summer, and obviously Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano in the States at the end of April. So there are now big fights which will top the bills. Taylor Serrano will be the first women's fight to top the bill in Madison Square Garden, in the big house as they call it, rather than the smaller arena down below. That is going to be mega as far as women's boxing, and like any big fight like that, like Tyson Fury, Wilder, or these things, right down the line across the world, there will be young girls watching that fight and watching Clarissa Shields and Savannah Marshall and being inspired to take up the sport. So the increase in numbers is going to happen in Wales as it does elsewhere.
Do you take much of an interest in the amateur scene in Wales?
I do. It's been pretty much paralysed by the pandemic, of course. There were no championships held in 2020. In 2021, they were rammed in November at the end of the year when restrictions began to ease. But yes, there are some good amateurs in Wales. We still have Rosie Eccles among the amateurs, of course, who was very unlucky not to go to the Olympics, in the sense that she lost to the Russian in the first fight of the Olympic qualifiers in London, which was abandoned halfway through when it became clear the seriousness of COVID-19 and fighters from abroad were wondering if they'd be allowed back into their own countries, and so that thing had to be cancelled halfway through. Since amateur boxing resumed, Rosie has won several multinational tournaments last year, including beating the Russian who'd beaten her. And so Rosie Eccles could well have been a medalist alongside Lauren Price. Now, if Rosie is still intending to compete in the Commonwealth Games, she can upgrade the silver she won last time to gold. Whether she has any intentions of going pro or whether she'd try for the Olympics next time, we'll wait and see. But there are also one or two other youngsters. It has to be said, the better talent in Wales, and obviously we're thinking with the Commonwealth Games this summer of who might medal for that. They're the Croft twins and Taylor Bevan and one or two others who are very talented male boxers. Females, not so much, apart from Rosie, and it's not known whether Rosie didn't compete in the Welsh Championships last year, which doesn't actually mean anything very much because she was competing internationally. But there are Helen Jones, who's doing quite well now, presumably will go. Hopefully Lana Cooper will have a go. Whether they decide Zoe Andrews is old enough now, she's only 19, I'm only just 19. But I'm sure they'll be competitive, but there's not someone who stands out like Lauren Price and Rosie did at the last Commonwealth Games.
Do you think there's anything that we can do in Wales to better support young women and girls who are interested in boxing?
There's always things you can do better, but I think it's improved so massively over the last 10 years that, in a sense, it's let it go, keep doing what you're doing. There are more and more girls. Port Talbot, for some reason, seems to be a hotbed of women's boxing. Zoe Andrews comes from Port Talbot, from the Sandfields estate, although she boxes for Britain Ferry. But any age group competition in Wales, you quite often tend to find if there's 5 entrants, 4 of them are coming from either Port Talbot Town, Carmarthen Hornets or Avon Spartans, the 3 clubs in the immediate area of Port Talbot. What it is about the water down there, I have no idea, but they don't seem to be producing that many male boxers these days, but they're producing some useful women boxers.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about Patrina Phillips?
Before Jane Couch and her lawsuit against the board, there was a very good woman boxer in Wales. Now, very few people at the time had heard of her because, of course, she wasn't licensed. She was fighting outside the influence of the Border Control. And her name was Patrina Phillips. Her father, Des, was an amateur trainer and a kickboxing trainer. Patrina and her brother, Dean, who went on to be a very good pro, had both won world kickboxing titles when they were about 13. Admittedly, there are even more world kickboxing titles than there are boxing titles. So take that with a pinch of salt, but they were clearly useful kickboxers. Both turned to boxing. Dean, as I say, went on to become a decent pro. But Patrina and the older sister, Aisha, also boxed professionally. But it was like some white collar shows are today, or the sort of things that used to happen in a back room of a pub, where there's no publicity, there's certainly no TV coverage. Back then, of course, there was no one filming them on their phones or anything. There wasn't any YouTube for it to appear on. And Patrina Phillips appeared topping the bill when her father promoted what presumably is still the only all-female card in Wales, in Swansea, in a nightclub in Swansea. And Patrina fought for the British title, although obviously not the board's British title, and drew in that. At the time, people in Britain were aware of women's boxing because of television from Germany in particular, where a young lady called Regina Halmich was a bit of a sensation. The German scene at the time, and indeed still, is largely peopled by boxers from elsewhere, East Europeans. The Klitschkos, of course, had their career in Germany. Juan Carlos Gomez from Cuba, Dariusz Mikulczewski, who fought Nicky Piper from Poland. Regina, as a homegrown German girl, was actually topping the bill. She was so popular with people like the Klitschkos on the undercard. And one of those shows, she defended her European title against Patrina Phillips. And Patrina gave her one heck of a fight. I mean, there are those who think that anywhere other than Germany, she'd have got the decision. Des was desperate for a rematch with Regina's world title. She had a world title at flyweight, and she defended the European at superfly. He said Patrina would come down to flyweight, and he cornered Hans-Peter Cole, who was Halmich's promoter, at a show in Cardiff, and pestered him to have a rematch. Cole just didn't want to know because he'd nearly lost his meal ticket with Regina, coming close to losing, and Patrina never got another chance to fight at the top. And of course, she'd retired by the time that boxing became legal in Britain when the board started granting licenses. But Petrina was outstanding. Aisha, her sister, totally different, blonde and bubbly. Petrina, dark and quiet. They were both pretty useful at it, and made a surprise appearance on the big screen. Actually, there was a film called Up and Under, which, although it purported to be about rugby league, starred Neil Morrissey and Samantha Janus. It was actually filmed in rugby clubs in South Wales, and in one scene there was a girls' boxing bout taking place in the background, and the two boxers in that were Petrina and Aisha Phillips, refereed by a great amateur trainer called Gareth Jones from Llanelli. So she did make the screen, but without any great credits for it.
And how old would Petrina have been at that stage?
Petrina was the youngest of the three. Dean was between the two girls. She would have been in her mid-20s, but she had medical problems. She had surgeries and whatever, which meant really that she couldn't train anymore, and she disappeared from the scene. Aisha was already the mother of a little girl and she didn't box as much anyway. Petrina was the good one, let's face it. But then that was the end of it, when, as far as women's boxing was concerned in Wales. There obviously had been women boxers before. Ronnie Rush, the great trainer who contributed to the world title successes of Steve Robinson and Robbie Regan, his wife had been a boxer. Now, I have absolutely no details about when and how and who she fought and where she fought, or even, I don't actually know whether she was Welsh or not. But they certainly lived in Ely in Cardiff. And she had been a boxer. So it dates from the days when boxing, women's boxing, was very much an underground thing. And I've been involved in boxing in Wales for approaching 60 years now, which is frightening. I'd heard of the occasional men's unlicensed shows and knew one or two fighters who'd been on them, but I'd never heard of women's fights on these shows, let alone women shows that had been entirely women. But there again, I didn't know anything about this all-women show that Des Phillips promoted in Swansea until I came to be researching Petrina and talking to Des for the book a few years ago that featured her. So these things could have gone on, maybe did go on, maybe on fairgrounds as well, although, again, fairgrounds and bare-knuckle fighting tend to be very much dominated by the travelling community. And until comparatively recently, gypsy girls didn't box. Pretty much every boy, it seems, boxed, but the girls didn't. Now we're seeing the amateurs, several girls from the travelling community boxing as well, which again is a good thing. But I doubt that there would have been anything on the traveller sites or at fairgrounds or anything that would have involved women, unless perhaps there's some sort of freak show like mud wrestling or something like that. But there is a whole undiscovered history of that era, whether these things did actually happen or not.
Can you remember any other instances of female boxers on screen in Wales?
There was a little history made in Whitland Amateur Boxing Club in 1997, which was when the amateur authorities worldwide said that girls could box. And the first show to feature them and therefore attracted interest across the UK and TV cameras from across the UK, was about between two 16-year-old friends called Marie Leaf and Marie Davis. And Marie Leaf won on points, and to be honest, whether either of them ever boxed again, I have no idea, because it seemed to go back in, and there were very few girls boxing in Wales until 2012. It's suddenly an Olympic sport. There is suddenly something to aim for. And suddenly there are a lot of people, particularly after 2012, people who've seen Nicola Adams, seen Katie Taylor. Suddenly they are now going into clubs, and clubs are seeing this as well, and building a new changing room if that's what's necessary, and welcoming them in. So that really is when women boxing took off, was the London Olympics, or at least when the women were allowed to box in Olympics, when it was first announced, say, a couple of years before that.
And do you think that Lauren Price is going to have that similar effect now after her Olympic debut?
I think she's already had that effect. I think she won Welsh Sports Personality of the Year as well. She won Olympian of the Year over the UK as a whole, which, when you consider some of the people she was up against, was an incredible achievement. So she's already having an influence on young people. The number of people who turned out to welcome her back when she came home to Wales is evidence of a massive interest in and I'm assuming that every young girl in the Rhymney Valley wants to be, is interested, at least the possibility of becoming the next Lauren Price. So yes, that will get even bigger when it comes to her becoming a pro, particularly if she boxes in Wales, particularly if she wins a title in Wales. One of the things about the show with Claressa Shields topping the bill in the Motorpoint Arena is that it has brought women boxing to a different audience. I think during the pandemic, because women fighters don't get paid so much, when you have no crowds, it was a very tempting situation for people like Hearn and Warren and other promoters to put some good women's fights, sometimes top of the bill, sometimes chief support, on these shows that were being televised to a captive audience at home. And there were some very good fights. It showed the standard. But those were only being watched by people, by and large, who already subscribed to the boxing channels. They weren't on free-to-air TV. And they will have perhaps convinced some of the doubters in the hardcore boxing fraternity that women's boxing is actually worth watching. And you forget that they're women and there's a damn good fight going on. The difference with, it applied to a certain extent with Katie Taylor, when Katie Taylor fought on the first show at the Millennium Stadium with Anthony Joshua, but that wasn't so much a Welsh show. I mean, there were 70,000 people there. I would hazard a guess that 50,000 of them were coming across the border because they were there to see Joshua, let's face it. Okay, people will have seen Katie Taylor and said, yes, she's good. But this one was in Cardiff. The vast majority of the crowd, which whatever it was, between 4,000 and 5,000, would have been Welsh, would have been there to watch Liam Williams and the other Welsh boys on the bill, but would have been part of the build-up of Claressa Shields, part of the build-up of Caroline Dubois as well, making her debut on that bill. And suddenly they will have seen Claressa Shields turn on a masterclass, or a mistress class perhaps, and they will perhaps not have really paid much attention to women's boxing at the top level, but I would expect that the majority of people who were there and watched that will want to watch at least Shields and Savannah Marshall when it happens. And that has raised an interest in women boxers among the general public, not the big boxing fans, but the people who would go to a show like last Saturday's because it was an event as much as anything else, rather than the hardcore ones who would have gone to the shows that Ashley Brace fought on. So I think last Saturday was an important step in normalising women's boxing in the eyes of the average Welsh sports fan. And I think that if that can be capitalised on with Lauren Price boxing in Wales for titles, I think that will be a mega step forward for women's boxing in Wales.